Hello, and welcome to our panel on human-robot interaction. I'll be your moderator today. I'm Holly Yanko from the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. Let me get my screen sharing started. So when you look up HRI on Google Images, as I did earlier today, apparently all human-robot interaction is people touching robots, robots touching people, people touching robots, and really in a close-up view. This is the top 10 image searches if you cut out any diagrams that are there, at least what I picked up this morning. So of course, human-robot interaction is much broader than this. But I would like to admit that I am guilty of the same sort of thing. So here's a NASA Valkyrie robot that we had for the last 4 years. We've returned her now to NASA. And of course, one of the first things that our students did with Valkyrie was not quite a handshake, but a fist bump. I wanted to give you some idea of what human-robot interaction is as I see it, well beyond, of course, human hands touching robot hands. These are examples I'm giving from my lab. So on the left-hand side, you see robots that are being sent into danger situations or distant situations. We just saw the landing of the Perseverance rover a short time ago. When we're controlling robots like this, we might be using augmented reality, virtual reality, large multi-touch boards, other ways of interacting with the robot systems. On the right-hand side, you see a telepresence robot. This is the Vigo system, which was then designed to be more autonomous. And now you're sending yourself remotely, but in a very different sort of way. And of course, the interaction is not just with you using the system remotely, but with the people who are around the robot system. Other examples are going to be robots used for factory settings or for home settings. Here we have a UR5 with a soft robotics gripper that's manipulating some of the YCB data set. And using that. So we need to think about how, if somebody wants to interrupt this robot and change what it's doing, how do they do that? How do people work side by side? How does the robot give an indication of what it's planning to do when working together with the person? I've worked in assistive technology for over 25 years, starting off with a robotic wheelchair system. Also looking at robot wheelchair mounted arms. We also have a UR5 on a scooter system in a collaborative project with Rob Platt at Northeastern University. As part of that project, we're projecting into the world, we're turning the world into its own interface so that you don't have a separate interface. You can project what you want into the world by indicating with a laser, or now we're actually indicating through the projector, through a dot that you can control. And then it shows you the object that it's planning to pick up before it picks that up. So now when you start thinking about human-robot interaction with assistive technology, in these cases, you're actually co-located with the robot. You're sitting on the robot, same as you would be with an automated car. On the right-hand side, you see examples of exoskeletons where not only are you co-located with the robot, you're wearing the robot system, whether the Defy Exoboot, in which case we're actually looking to make that more adaptive using soft sensors developed in Rebecca Kramer-Batiglio's lab at Yale University, or the Lockheed Martin system, which is actually trying to do some predictive behaviors itself. Other things that come up when you're doing human-robot interaction is, how can people trust robots? How can people know what robots are doing? How can robots explain themselves? So in this case, you can see the video is displaying its path on the floor to show where it's intending to go. If a robot can explain what it's done or what it's going to do, that's one way to allow people to build trust in a robot system and be more comfortable being around it. So I'm going to start off the panel with a bold assertion. I believe that all of robotics is human-robot interaction. I claim it all, yay, and I think the panel's going to agree with me. Although I will give in just slightly, and I'll allow that there's some small robotics piece, epsilon, that we can take out. But when you're thinking about robotics and human-robot interaction, really everything that we're developing in some way is going to interact with a person. Whether they're riding that robot, whether they're a bystander to that robot, whether they're using it remotely, you know, there's so many ways that we're going to be using these robots. So really, human-robot interaction is, I believe, the future of robotics. And with that, I'd like to open up to our panelists. We have 4 great panelists today. Our first panelist is Maya Matar from the University of Southern California, who I'm going to introduce after I stop sharing my screen. Sorry, I was joking that I had to have mission control here. Maya Matar is the Chan Sung Shung Distinguished Professor in the Computer Science Department, Neuroscience Program, and the Department of Pediatrics, and Interim Vice President for Research at the University of Southern California. She's the founding director of the USC Robotics and Autonomous System, RASC, co-director of the USC Robotics Research Lab, and the lead of the Viterbi K-12 STEM Center. She received her PhD in computer science and artificial intelligence from MIT in 1994. Maya.
Thank you, Holly. Let me share my screen. We don't always have to give the year, do we? All right, so I am going to completely agree with you that all robotics should be HRI, but I'm going to dive even deeper into a specific sub-area of HRI because we can't help ourselves, right? But let's take the big view. So, back before even some of our times, robotics was about the 3Ds, the dirty, dull, and dangerous, right? We were going to create machines that were going to take over the work that we as humans didn't want to do. But here we are in 2021, and that's really not what we're focusing on. In fact, our goal is to create machines simply because we think we can create them. So, the sky's the limit, sky and beyond, anything that we can envision. And I guess the first message I would really like to have people think about is the fact that we might need some more balance in our now unbounded pursuits. There's a tremendous focus on automation, but automation by definition is replacement. So we're trying to optimize something, and typically we're optimizing against human work, which can be quite inefficient, expensive, it gets old, it gets tired, it breaks. And what I would really love to focus on is augmentation. This other area, which many of the, if you will, founding folks of robotics have talked about, which is enhancing the human ability to work. So rather than replacing, enhancing. It's of course a spectrum, and we need both. But right now we're overweighting automation. And so the first thing I want to say about HRI is that HRI is a natural environment in which we're looking at augmenting or enhancing human ability. But I'm going to focus in even more specifically now on ways in which physical robots can enhance the human ability to work and give care and receive care without actually doing physical work. So I guess the big picture I'd love to leave people with to think about and certainly ask questions about is this role of robots in our society, which can include a critical piece that doesn't actually involve physical work. So that's interesting for machines that were originally thought of and conceived as physical labor machines. And the specific field that I want us to think about is socially assistive robotics, which is machines helping people help themselves by using social instead of physical interaction. And the real focus here is on providing the scaffolding or the support to people, typically through motivation and companionship socialization. And this is a very, very big niche because there's really a convergence of technologies and disciplines, whether you're interested in helping the very young or the quite elderly or everybody in between. And I'm just going to touch on just a few of those. If you look at the spectrum of human challenges, they're huge. They go across the age spectrum and they look at the cross-section of abilities. So we could be looking at people who have lost or are born with some deficiency or difference where the machine can help them to train and be more capable. Or we can look at really superhuman abilities, right? Where we can, through anywhere from physical to cognitive to social to emotional augmentation. So there's a real spectrum in which machines can make a key difference. And then the bit that none of us thought about before, but here it is. We're hit with the big challenge, the pandemic. Oops, it's misspelled. It'll be fixed. And if you think about that challenge that just sort of faced us out of the blue, we have adapted in very interesting ways, but we're also seeing very undesirable side effects of the current technological solutions. So again, here's a role for HRI. If we had had some of the machines that we're still developing, even this life under the pandemic might have looked different. So I want to talk about barriers before I talk about the really neat stuff, because I want to end up with the hope. But let's talk about barriers first, because barriers are things that we really need to address as a field. So the obvious one is that we don't really have great HRI robot platforms. We really are at the mercy of consumer products, right? We use whatever is available. The PR2, which was not really a consumer product even, so that was one example of kind of a research-driven platform. But, Baxter used extensively in HRI research, never designed for HRI research. The Now, Curie, Pepper, and then you notice that some of these are, have actually are no longer available because the companies are no longer available. And these designs are not informed by the needs of HRI research. So it's hard to do HRI when you have to make do with whatever platforms are available that are designed for other things. That's a barrier. We don't have ready access to real world domains. I'm going to be very, very pointed about people should work on real world problems. Stop doing convenient things, do the hard, important things. But to do hard, important things, you have to go out into the hard parts in the real world, hospitals and homes and elder care centers and, assembly lines and factories, et cetera. And that's really hard to do. And everybody has to do it on their own. And that's just too hard. So people don't get out of the lab. So those pathways need to be made better and more open. And then we don't have data sets. This is an intersection now with machine learning and HCI, where most data sets that are readily available are very convenient. And I will say, honestly, not very challenging. Because if the data you're using are data that were collected, let's say, from Skype, well, they're very biased and the interactions are not really that interesting. So there's very little incentive to really collect and share data. And that's a problem because we need those data sets, whatever the data may be. And they're not just visual and audio. They could be tactile, they can be movement. So much opportunity at the intersection of HRI and machine learning, if only we could have more interesting data. All right, just one more slide on why it's hard. It is, no one really understands why HRI is hard. It's kind of the way people don't understand why robotics is hard. Well, if you're not a roboticist, if you're merely a computational person, oh, how hard can it be? You just put it in a robot. Well, we all know how hard it can be. But it's the same with HRI. Outside of HRI, people tend to think of HRI as, quote, soft. And the only thing I have to say about that is what is harder than getting people to do things? Give me a harder problem. And so HRI is very hard. It's complex. It's interdisciplinary. But that isn't quite well appreciated yet, and it'll help when it's appreciated. Because it really goes well beyond engineering and computing. It goes into, cognitive science, neuroscience, behavioral science, social science, behavior economics, my favorite area. So a whole lot going on here in terms of interdisciplinary knowledge that's needed that makes it both interesting and also challenging. And then from a technical perspective, it's of course challenging because people are moving targets physically and metaphorically. And that's just complex for interaction. And currently, we're really focused on narrow and specific uses of HRI because that's what we can do. But of course, there is much more to be done. And just like Holly's point, I use the same images. This is the vision of HRI today. Some imaginary, some real. We need to move well beyond and broader. And so for the last 15 years, that's what we've been trying to do. We've been putting real robots into the wild for long-term deployments increasingly, so up to 6 months in a real-world setting like a nursing home, more than a month in the home with kids with autism, with Alzheimer's patients, et cetera, and really learning what is really hard and real about HRI. And that's the big selling point I have for people. This is what you need to do. You need to get out of the lab. Let me just show you some of the stuff we're excited about. For example, interactions with infants, robots and infants. Look at that. Talk about a complex human to interact with. What is this human thinking? What will this human do next? What will happen in 2 minutes? A lot will happen in 2 minutes in an infant's life. And it turns out we really want to work with infants because if we want to help them, the interaction with the robot will elicit and drive their behavior in a unique way that cannot be done even with adult humans or any other technology. Screens definitely will not do it. So there's some amazing potential things we can do for human health by doing early detection and intervention with infants with robots. But it's just starting out. And who's working on it? What, like 3 of us? So let's bring some more people in. Another area, of course, this is one where a lot of people are working and increasingly more, but very few compared to, let's say, automation. So HRI for autism, a major area of potential.
Meet Adrian, age 6.
This is some great work.
And his robot friend, Kiwi.
You are doing an amazing job.
On this weekend morning, they've settled in to play some games, along with big brother Darren. Adrian is on the autism spectrum, and Kiwi is no toy. It's a socially assistive robot.
You are doing really great. Keep up the good work.
So there's a great deal of work to show why these interactions with a physically embodied robot are critical for scaffolding social learning for children on the spectrum, as well as cognitive gains. So there's just a tremendous deal of potential there. more like 10,000 peer-reviewed journal papers on this, not only in robotics, but well outside of robotics as well, using robots. So another area of potential. Looks like it's big, but it's actually quite small compared to the larger field. So what we really need is more of these real-time, multimodal, real-world, purposeful HRI interactions and data sets and studies. And so here's just another example. This is a young child interacting with a robot in real time. That robot is monitoring eye gaze, body movement, vocalizations, and game state in order to provide feedback in real time. Why don't we have this? Why don't we, during the pandemic right now, have a machine like this for every child who is now left with having to study from home? Well, we should, if more people worked in the field. And so I just want to end by saying that well-designed human-robot interaction can be truly empowered for human outcomes in health, in learning, in training, which of course affect both work and care. And so we have some amazing things that we can do as a field, but only if we work on real world problems. I'll stop there and thank you.
Thanks, Maya. For the audience, if you check your chat, you'll see there's a Slido link. You can go there to put in some questions for the panelists as we go along. And I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Professor Dana Kulick develops autonomous systems that can operate in concert with humans, using natural intuitive interaction strategies while learning from user feedback to provide an individualized operation over long-term use. In collaboration with Professor Elizabeth Croft, she pioneered systems to quantify and control safety during HRI based on both robot and human perception. Working with Professor Nakamura at the University of Tokyo, she developed one of the first systems to implement continuous learning from demonstration. The system was a first step towards robots that can learn from non-experts, as it did not require the demonstrator to segment or scaffold the demonstration. Dana. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Holly, for the introduction. And thanks to the IFRR for organizing this colloquium. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation. So I want to, in my brief talk, I want to highlight, I want to talk a bit about the role of learning in human-robot interaction. So when we think about human-robot interaction, for most of us, well before we encountered a real robot, we became aware of robots through fiction. The robots of our imagination are not just capable of performing a variety of tasks, they can anticipate our wishes and cater to our every need. Unfortunately, real robots are very far from achieving these capabilities yet. So why is this? And as Maya highlighted, part of the problem is that our techniques for developing robot behaviors have come from this robotics industrial background, where robots operate in very carefully controlled environments that are largely separated from humans, where every action can be anticipated and pre-programmed. However, when we think about moving robots to human environments, now we're dealing with very dynamic environments, and the humans themselves in those environments are not always predictable. And this is especially true as we move from trained operators to a wider population of users. So to work successfully with a broad range of users and environments, robots need to become much more adaptable and agile. And so we're thinking that they need to learn the preferences and needs of users. And recently, as we all know, machine learning has been demonstrating some really exciting results. So how about applying machine learning to solve some of these issues? So in this video, I'm showing this recent example of a reinforcement learning algorithm that demonstrated the ability of agents to learn to adapt to other agents and to develop emergent skills just during interaction. So as we can see, machine learning is making amazing progress. However, many of the current algorithms rely on the ability to learn in simulation. They rely on the ability to learn from mistakes and from errors. And they also typically require millions of samples. So for example, if you notice in the results from this particular paper, the horizontal axis scale is 10 to samples times 10 to the 9. And so these assumptions may not be appropriate for HRI. So how can we deploy some of these amazing algorithms and advancements in machine learning to the context of HRI? So as both Holly and Maya already highlighted, HRI is very broad, and there are many possible configurations. So what needs to be learned and what is known depends on the task and on the context. And I want to focus specifically on a particular part of the context, and that is the role of the human and the robot, and also thinking about how to think about these different roles and how to handle different types of users. So one possible role configuration is that we have a human teacher and a robot learner. In this case, the human knows what they want the robot to do, but needs to impart this knowledge to the robot. So how can the teacher impart the knowledge to the robot? So it could be through demonstrations, it could be through preferences, it could be through corrections, and we could have the robot and the person both being co-located, or they could be there could be asynchrony between the time that the demonstrations are collected and the robot is learning to reproduce. So a common approach is to learn from demonstrations. So in this example video, the robot has been provided with demonstrations. So this is the LASA handwriting dataset. And from these demonstrations, it needs to learn how to write various letters and shapes. So from the demonstrations, it extracts the objective, and then it uses some a priori knowledge, in this case, the knowledge of its own model and a model predictive controller, to achieve the objective. So the implication here is that the robot knows how to perform motion skills, but needs to learn from the person what is the objective of each motion skill. And the robot might also have some additional constraints that it needs to ensure are satisfied in addition to achieving the demonstrated task. And these additional constraints could also be either known a priori, or they might also need to be learned from the demonstration. Now, when we're observing these demonstration, one important question is what can we assume about the human teacher? So a lot of learning from demonstration methods assume that the teacher is an expert, but this might not be a correct assumption. And it turns out that if we make an incorrect assumption about the expertise of the demonstrator, that could result in significant error in estimating the demonstrator's objective. So recently we've been thinking about how can we jointly estimate both the objective and the expertise from demonstrations. So here's a quick example from a teleoperation data set. So we have users of varying expertise levels who were asked to pilot a robot to a target. And in the left panel, you see the participant specification and demonstration, and the blue dotted line is their demonstrated trajectory. And on the right, we see the same participant specification and then the path that's generated using the recovered cost function and assuming perfect expertise. So we can see that the human demonstration contains a small number of deviations from the straight path, which is likely due to some teleoperation interface challenges. And we can use an approach where we're simultaneously estimating expertise and objective to basically recover the underlying objective and generate the straight line path. A second possible role assignment is if we have the opposite case. So we have a robot teacher and a human learner. A really nice example of this is when we have rehab robots. So in the case of rehab robots, the robot typically knows the target motion profile, but the question is, how does that help the patient to get there? So in this case, the robot knows the objective, but needs to learn the optimal policy. And particularly in the case of rehabilitation, we can expect that the optimal approach might be patient-specific, and it might even change for the same patient over time. For example, if they get tired during a session, or if they improve over multiple sessions. So our learning needs to be patient-specific and likely online. So here's an example of a system that we've been developing. So here, the long-term objective here is to help Parkinson's disease patients to correct their gait by providing cues. So we provide cues, and then we measure the resulting gait. And within the control loop, we want to learn the model of how the cues influence gait for this particular individual at this time. And then we want to use that model to generate the best cue to bring the person to the target gait. So here's some preliminary results. So what we can see in the bottom panel, we see that the learning system requires an initial exploratory phase, but after about the first 70 seconds, it converges to a usable model and can then generate appropriate cues. And then in the top panel, we can see that after convergence, the resulting cues enable the participants to achieve a lower error with respect to the target gait cadence compared to fixed or proportional cues. And importantly, the resulting cue policy is different for each user and depends on how responsive they are to the cues. The last role assignment that I want to touch on is when we have human-robot peers. So in this case, the robot and the person are working together to accomplish a shared task, and they may have complementary capabilities. So an example that I'm showing here is the drone landing. So here we have a human pilot that is trying to land a drone on a target. This task can be challenging, especially for novice pilots, due to both perception and interface issues. So we would like to develop a shared autonomy system where the robot can infer what the objective of the pilot is, so where we should land, and also learn a policy to help the drone land there. So we've been investigating how we can use domain randomization over simulated users to help us learn such a policy in simulator and then use the learned policy during physical cooperation. And you can see here in this video, here we have basically a shared autonomy system where the robot figures out what the intended target of the person is and then makes small adjustments to the pilot's instructions to achieve the correct landing. And then I'll just quickly highlight, briefly highlight some results. So these are results from human participants of varying skill level that tried to land a drone in a simulator. The blue dots show the unassisted landings, while the green dots show the assisted landings. We can see that all the pilots did much better assisted compared to unassisted. And promisingly, in assisted mode, we were able to get all the pilots to achieve excellent performance regardless of skill level. So to summarize, some of the questions that we've been thinking about when learning during HRI is what should be learned and what can we assume is known? So do we need to learn the objective? Can we assume that we know the objective and need to learn how to achieve the objective, or do we need to learn both? And if we can have some a priori knowledge, of course, that can help improve the speed of learning. Then the second question is, what can we learn in simulation and what must be learned during physical interaction? And that's very closely related to questions about what do we know and what can we assume about the human partner. So can we assume that there are some shared commonalities between users, in which case we might want to use some kind of big data approaches? Or can we come up with a good model or a way to parameterize the population of users that would allow us to learn in simulation? Or do we need to learn individual characteristics that may be changing with time that we need to learn during online interaction? So I'll stop there and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. We're going to take a pause on the panelists now to open up to some questions from the front row. So we have on our front row, Harold So, Tadahiro Taniguchi, Heiwan Park, and Giulio Sandini. What do you guys have for questions so far?
Can I go?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Maya. Thank you, Dana. Wonderful talk. The question I had while listening to your talk was, how do you research for user needs? So when we develop like robots for certain applications and certain user groups, we kind of like think what they would need and implement something. But in your research, how do you study the user needs? And even when you have like a target group, the needs of individuals can vary and have a spectrum. So how do you afford your system to adapt to that need?
I'll kick that off, since that is very much the focus. It's at the heart of what we do. But actually, just this morning, I was talking to a colleague and we were thinking about writing something up about robot design, where I'm thinking that really this ability to adapt to the user doesn't have to be a special needs population or anything. I mean, for anybody, it really is a moving target. So I think right now, what we have is a very stationary idea of what the system should look like and what it should do. It's like, well, I'm going to design it. When I design it right, the person will like it and it'll be good. But in fact, there's no such thing. And that's the problem with the current robots, is that, the ones that are on the consumer market, right? They can't do enough and they don't please enough people. So what do we do? What's the answer? I think you have to constantly interact with the user population throughout the process from the very beginning. So it's never a good idea to have engineers come up with an idea of what people want. Sorry. Unless the people are specifically the engineers of the type in the lab, you're wrong. You're just wrong. I'm sorry. It's painful, but it's true. So you have to get out. I always tell my students, one day outside of the lab is worth a year in the lab. It's true. right? So a lot of talking to people and a lot of piloting. And piloting is so painful, right? Because it's hard to recruit and you don't really want to spend time on this process and it delays your publications and data collection. But guess what? If you don't pilot, you're going to end up collecting data on something that is just really, really not ready. And you know it, then you throw half the data out and you make do with what you have, but it doesn't work. And so this iterative design is necessary, and it's the same for products. And it is hard, right? I've worked with companies and I see what they do, and they do market research early on. And then it's like, okay, now we've locked in and we know what we want. Oh, and then at the other end, you discover, oops, maybe that wasn't quite what people wanted. So it really is very much an ongoing process. And that's hard because people don't want to take the time. Oh, I should say, and I didn't answer the other part of the question, and I'll keep it short. The other part is personalization. So just as Dana was saying, it's about learning, right? So we need to always have the system continually learning and changing its behavior within bounds to the user. And that's hard because honestly, right now, no machine learning models are meant for that. Everything is meant for, there's a certain goal that I want to reach. Once I get there, I'm done. But this is not, it's a non-stationary problem. The person is changing over time, the user. And so the system also needs to adapt over time. So that's a great challenge for robotics and HRI and ML.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. And I want to, second, I agree with everything that Maya has said, but I want to also highlight actually the adaptation of the user to the system. Because that is actually sometimes happening at an even more rapid pace than even our best learning algorithms. And especially when users are first being exposed to a new technology, they can kind of very rapidly, they have an initial idea, oh, this is what I think I want to use the robot for. And then when they start, using the robot, they realize like, oh, my preconceived ideas are, my initial ideas are not the right way, but then they can come up with new things that they want the robot to do, or new ways that they think about using the robot. So I think this kind of mutual adaptation is something that we need to think about, and involving users, not just in the kind of, not only in the piloting stage, but even at during the very initial design of the system, can be really, really useful. So we've been running these just workshops with users for robots in public settings, and what we see is that just even within like a single workshop, where it's kind of a participatory design workshop, users can go from having one idea about, this is what I want the robot to do, to a completely different idea. And so I think we're kind of a lot of times, Maya is exactly right. When we have like engineers and computer scientists sitting around and being like, yeah, our robot is going to do this. And then we spend all this time developing that. And then we bring it to our first pilot test and realize like, oh, this is totally not what the users want.
Yeah, so in the beginning, I also said that it's very challenging to do human-robot interaction, but even more, I think that humans are very forgiving for robots, and when something goes wrong, we think, oh no, what's going to happen? And they say, oh, how cute, he fell. It's really like alive. He also makes mistakes like us. So that sometimes even simplifies the thing. And then also for the appearance of the robot, how that should be. On one hand, you have the engineers that design it, or sometimes also artists, like our Probo, our social robot, was designed by an artist. And so now we go a bit in between, where we have genetic algorithms and we propose different designs to end users, and then they can choose what they like, and then we breed a new generation, and like that, we see that we evolve for a certain purpose, to a more optimal design, and as such includes in a more quantitative way the desires and needs of the end user, because how otherwise you can capture that to bring in, for example, in a design.
Yes. Sorry, just to, oops, sorry.
It's okay.
Julio's had his hand raised, so maybe
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, yes. I mean, this is just because Dana was mentioning this, the reciprocity. I mean, this idea of, of mutual interaction, which sometimes it is lacking in human-robot interaction. In some sense, some examples looks more like broadly speaking, teleoperation more than interaction. I wonder, what do you consider to be, the main features that you need of a robot in order to build up a familiarity with the human partner, and the familiarity which does not lead to to a boring situation, which is what we mostly get now from these personal robot examples. People get bored after a while. So I wonder, if the idea of the human robot understanding, the work there should be much more focused on understanding humans and being able to convey messages to humans more than trying to understand, what the humans are doing. So reversing the topic, not understanding the human, or not only understanding the humans, but also being able for a robot to convey messages to the human, to establish a mutual understanding a relationship, which hopefully does not bring to boredom, which is what you get if the system is not reacting as you expect.
I could do a really quick answer. I'm getting some sense that we don't have a lot more time left for questions. So I will in this session. So I'll just say that I completely agree. It's really an interaction dynamic. So the best models we have are from human-human interaction, and people do study that in HRI, and it's really important. And then, of course, we have to actually create the dynamic with the robot and keep it going. A major part of it is content, and you do see that in HCI. So people are, even in products, like, look at Alexa, it's starting to, like, all the time, it might surprise you a little bit, and that's what keeps it from being boring. But that's also thanks to literally armies of people who are adding that content on a daily basis, something that's very hard to do for little companies and research robots. But that ability to be generative and a little surprising, but not wildly unexpected, that's really a trick about engaging people. I'll keep it short, and Dana might want to add to that.
I think Harold had a question, so maybe I just will.
No, it's okay. We're running out of time a little bit, I understand. So maybe you can get
We're not really running out of time. We were to take this break for these questions, but we do have two more panelists we want to get to. But Harold, ask your question. We've got a little bit of time.
Sure. This is related to Bram's comment about, the robot's kind of cute when it falls down, but it's cute the first time or maybe the second time, but the 10th time it falls down, I think people start wondering, what kind of robot is this? And I think this alludes to the fact that a lot of our research focuses on short-term interactions, maybe 10 minutes, 30 minutes in the lab, but we really want to get to those long-term interactions, months or years even. How do we get there? It seems so challenging. So do you have any ideas how we can push our research, extend it from minutes to months to years?
By getting out of the lab and actually doing it. So,
yeah,
we did it. We stayed in the homes for 5 to 6 weeks. We stayed in a nursing home for 6 months. You just have to get out and do it. You have to say to your students, you don't get a PhD unless you get out in the real world. And by the way, convenience studies and MTurk are not the real world. And, amazing students step up to the challenge. And that's why I'm so proud of the work, that I showed. I haven't seen a company do this, but you see amazing students do it because they're motivated. But there has to be an expectation by the people leading the research, and that's us. And yes, and then you discover things like, people get bored. They do things like we've had kids want to reveal the robot. So they kept throwing things on the robot and pulling them back, which of course, when you put a thing on the robot, it can't see. So now it's incredibly stupid because it's not perceiving anything. So there are a whole bunch of, and then there are interesting opportunities, right? Where when the robot doesn't know something, which is often, it can engage the user, but it has to do it in an interesting way. It can't always be like, I don't know what's going on, I'm really dumb. But it'll say, hey, if you tell me something, I'll tell you a joke. Or there are all kinds of things we can do once we are actually forced to face the problem, which we are only forced to do when we get out in the real world.
Thanks.
All right, and there was one audience question that was directly to Dana from Claudia Darpino. And she asks, as you mentioned, RL approaches require extensive data and simulation. What are your thoughts on using simulated humans with basic behaviors?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting and promising area of research, because then we can kind of use the simulator to do extensive learning, and then be much more ready to interact, and maybe we just need to do some fine tuning. So one of the key questions is, how can we create this model of a person that we can use to learn in the simulator? And I think that's a very much an open challenge. I think one interesting idea is to kind of think about the concept of domain randomization, right? So I don't know exactly what kind of user I can expect, but I can maybe, if I can create a model, a parametrized model that hypothesizes a range of users, and then I can kind of learn over these different users. That might help me be more robust when I encounter a specific user. But yeah, I think it's a very interesting and open question.
Thank you. So we're going to move to listening to our last two panelists, and we'll have a lot more discussion after that. So our next panelist is Kirsten Dautman. Since 2018, she's been a Canada 150 Research Chair at Intelligent Robotics at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. She has a joint appointment with the Departments of Electrical and Computer Engineering and Systems Design Engineering, and is cross-appointed with the David R. Sheridan School of Computer Science at the University of Waterloo. She is a visiting professor at the University of Hertfordshire in the UK. In Waterloo, she is Director of Social Intelligent Robotics Research Laboratory. The main areas of her research are human-robot interaction, social robotics, assistive technology, and artificial in life. Dr. Dautman received her PhD and Bachelor of Science degrees from the University of Bielefeld. Kirsten.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Holly, for the introduction. So, similar to some of the previous speakers, I have interests in using robots in care settings, also human-robot learning. But in order to complement some of the presentations today, I thought I will focus on biologically inspired research into human-robot interaction, in particular when it comes to design. So here in Waterloo, like in many other labs worldwide, we have a whole variety of different robots, some of them machine-like, well, humanoid/machine-like looking, like the Fetch robot, humanoid robots like the Pepper robot, or on the top right, you see the Mirror robot, so a more animal-like robot. But also on the left, one of my favorite robots, the ICAP, who has just 2 weeks ago crossed the Atlantic from IIT to join us here in Waterloo. So as you've seen, we have very different robot designs, also then associated different possibilities of how these robots can behave and interact with people. And in certain application areas, there may be certain reasons why we choose one or the other robot. We also sometimes engage in building robots if we don't have a robot that is suitable for a particular application area. Robots are a moving target. When I started working with robots more than 20 years ago, these were very different robots from what we have today, and probably very different from what we will have in 10 years' time. New robots come on the market. Other designs get obsolete. And there's also very interesting ideas in terms of what Cindy Bethel and Robin Murphy coined appearance-constrained robots. So robots that do not have these natural social interaction capabilities, but how can we still make them suitable for human-robot interaction? And what I'm talking about now today is taking inspiration from biology, because humans are not the only social animals. So, for example, when it comes to making robots expressive, either recognizing facial expressions in humans, but also the robot expressing facial emotions, there's this famous facial action coding system that's being used widely also in HRI and robotics. But actually, if you do just a little bit of research in the biological literature, there are also some other models. People have actually studied in how rats express emotions with their ears, with their noses, with the whisker changes, for example. And I've become quite interested in that. Can we, if we have a robot that is not human-like, can we take some inspiration from this type of work? And so one example is with the Mirror robot. It clearly has an animal-like shape, but it's not being designed to imitate any particular animal. Some people say it looks like a rabbit or a dog or like a deer. But so how can we design effective expressions for this robot? And this has been a collaboration also involving ethologists and researchers at University of Waterloo, where we designed a whole series of different emotions, but also moods. Together, you call these affective expressions. And we took various inspirations from dogs, rabbits, mice, humans, but also cartoon characters. Because this robot, the mirror robot, has a variety of different expressions with the movement in the eyes, the neck, the head, the ear, the tail. It can also have some colors, expressions, and movements, of course. So we went through a whole large literature research on trying to take inspirations from biology, how to design these expressions, and then evaluated them. We designed them and then also evaluated them. That was during COVID-19, so the study was done after March 2020. So it was an online study. It was a video study. So here you see just some examples of different expressions. The advantage was we then had a good number of participants, and we could show that in particular for expressions such as happy, sad, surprised, calm, and tired, that the correct expression was selected significantly more than the others. So interestingly, it was also related. People's ability to recognize emotions in the mirror robot was also related to how good they are in recognizing human emotions. We used a standardized test here that's being used in the literature. So another example here was to see how can we translate the behavior of animals into robot behavior, social behavior. And that was a collaboration with Adam Miklosi's research group at Edward Laurent University in Hungary. He has been a pioneer studying dog-human interaction for many, many years. And the idea here was that we wanted basically to explore how far can we go with non-verbal interaction, in particular when it comes to trying to recognize the intentions of a robot. And so this was inspired by hearing dogs, so dogs that are assisting people who are deaf. This gives you an example of what a dog would do if it wants to alert the owner that the doorbell is ringing. Okay, so we then analyze this behavior in great detail and the different steps and behaviors that the dog showed in order to guide the person to the door. And we identified in particular 3 behaviors that we then translated into a flow chart for a robot. So we didn't use a dog-like robot. We thought that was a little bit too easy. We used a robot that we had available in the smart home in the UK at the University of Hertfordshire, the robot house, and we used a very machine-like robot. It could move its head and neck and the base, and of course it could navigate, it could move, but we tried to translate this dog behavior into a human robot interaction experiment to see, do people recognize the intentions of the robot, for example, when it wants to guide the person to the door. And so we did an extensive experiment here, and we found that the majority of participants were indeed very well able to understand the dog-inspired visual communication signals as expressed by the robots. Keep in mind, these participants were not trained in any way on the robot's behavior, and they were able also to not just recognize the robot's intentions correctly, but to follow the robot, similar to the person in the video with the dog, then following the dog to the door. We did basically the same here. The last example I wanted to mention is when I moved to Canada, I noticed that basketball is really big here. So in front of every house here in my neighborhood, there's a basketball hoop outside, and all the children play basketball, well, during summer anyway. So since I'm interested in working with children with special needs, I thought, well, what about children who cannot play physical games, which is so important for social behavior, cognitive, emotional development? Can we have a robot that can play basketball? So the child could play with the robot basketball with another child. And so that led to this project of the robot, which we called MyJ. We had a co-design approach, which, as you've heard earlier today, is very important. So to connect with potential users really, really early. We also, again, that was done during COVID-19. We did also phone and video interviews with families of children with physical disabilities. So children confined to a wheelchair who are not able to actually play ball with their hands. And this then led to a robot that, with my wonderful design team at University of Waterloo, could actually pick up robots and shoot them. And very recently, we also did another remote study with users, asking them about the behavior of the robot and possible input that they could give. So the idea here is that you could have a robot that would act as a mediator to allow children who cannot play physical games to engage with other children. So the very final one is about research we've done for many years with children with autism. Going back to field studies and how necessary it is to go out in the field, we've recently published an article about a year-long study where the robot we developed, called Casper, was used in a nursery school for young children with autism for more than a year without researchers present. We sometimes went there to maintain the robot or to develop new games for the robot, but it was used by the teachers. And actually, last time when I checked, it's still being used there after more than 5 years in that particular school by the teachers. So the last point I want to make in this particular application area is the what I would call the disappearing robot scenario. In one of the studies, we had a robot for 6 months being used by a family with a boy with autism. And after 6 months, when we asked the family, would you still like to keep the robot? They said, no, actually, our son has made so much progress, it is not needed anymore, which then led me think about this concept of the disappearing robot. Sometimes the greatest success you have with a therapy robot is if the robot is no longer needed. Which, of course, if you think about business models, if you think about people wanting to maybe sell millions of these robots, expensive robots, to someone's home where it might only be needed for half a year or a year, then this is problematic. So just to wrap up, there's actually one more point. Another issue that I want to emphasize, and it hasn't been mentioned yet, very often application areas are interesting where you can do with a robot what you cannot do with a human being. For example, if you have a robot, you can actually show what the robot can see. And we have recently used it in a study to teach children with autism about visual perspective taking, where we showed in a long-term studies with those children that we can actually improve their skills. And in the initial stages, we had a screen next to the robot where the children could actually see through the robot's eyes. And then later, they had to be able to master these tasks without the screen. But it was a stepping stone. So sometimes, rather than thinking about jobs for robots that also people can do in the same way, or to enhance people's skills, sometimes we can also think about, can we do with robots what we cannot do with a human being? Because after all, I would never be able to see literally what another person sees through their eyes, but this is easy to do with a robot. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The final speaker on our panel is Bram van der Brot, who is a professor at the Free University of Brussels. His research is on mechatronic systems for cognitive and physical human-robot interaction with applications in healthcare and manufacturing. He has many European Union projects on applications of robotic systems for assistance. Sorry. Every time people share it, wipes my screen. For assistance to people in their daily lives. He received his PhD in 2009 in applied sciences and has performed research at AIST in Japan and IIT in Genoa. Bram.
Thank you. Good evening. Thanks, Ollie, for the kind introduction. I'm indeed Bram van der Brot and part of Robotics of the University of Brussels, and very recently also part of IMIC, which is a very large research institute on microelectronics. And there is a famous paradox in robotics. What is often very trivial for humans as walking, manipulating objects, is still very difficult for robots. While constant quality, repetitive jobs, not becoming bored, that's easy for robots. So this learns us two lessons. Instead of replacing humans with robots, why not use the complementary skills? And that is why we focus on human-robot collaboration. And secondly, the human is still a very rich source of inspiration to build better robots. And when talking about human-robot interaction, most people will think indeed about social robots. And when we interact with robots, we want to have the human central. And so the robot has to be able to understand and express social cues. And we did quite some work on this, but I will only briefly touch this because a lot of the previous speakers extensively talked about this. And our Pepper robots are also not in the lab anymore. They are since the start of the pandemic, helping in hospitals and elderly care homes. And we also did a very large study on with children with autism, with more than 70 children in the EU project DREAM. And each of them had 12 sessions on aspects as turn-taking, joint attention, and imitation. And moreover, all the data is now also open accessly available. But this is also very relevant in other sectors. And when Audi Brussels wanted to introduce cobots in their factory for glue operation, they reached out to us. And when we entered the factory, we quickly saw that workers were afraid of a new wave of robotization. And so we included sociologists in the project, and together with the workers, we developed this cobot. And so social interaction between the workers was very important. And so we gave the robot similar skills to become part of the team. And since there is too much noise and many languages, especially in Brussels, that's why we focused on non-verbal communication. So the robot was able to recognize gestures, and an animated head could express emotions, and that it's a pity we cannot show anymore because we have some copyright issues with the artist that designed the head of it. And so the robot became a huge success. Workers were really proud to work with the robot. And it's the only robot, and there are more than 500 robots in Audi Brussels, with a nickname. And also the quality improved a lot. And it was used a very long time on the actual production floor at Audi Brussels, but not now anymore because they turned to the new electric e-tron. But the project allowed that many more cobots were successfully introduced at Audi Brussels. And the vision for collaboration we also see now in applications which people thought would be completely done autonomously as vacuum cleaning. I have now children, and my old Roomba only cleans my sleeping room, not the rest of the house. It's too cluttered with toys. We are, due to the pandemic, much more home. And yeah, it doesn't fit so much how the robot blends in. So I think this is a smart vision to also there go towards human-robot collaboration. And for this, a multidisciplinary approach is needed. For our manufacturing robots, we work with sociologists. Our workers accepting to use our technology. And we include ergonomics, so that aspect is investigated by human physiologists. Robots for children with autism, their psychologists from the start did the experiments. Our rehab robots, we work with rehabilitation scientists, and that we encapsulated in robotics that has 9 research groups from technical sciences, as we robotic scientists, AI lab, but also the medical, human, and social sciences. And now with the rise of AI, people think this is the only what we still need to solve. And certainly this is a very crucial aspect. And that's why we also closely work together with the AI lab. And here, for example, we develop interactive reinforcement learning algorithms to teach very intuitively new assembly skills to robots. But this is not sufficiently alone. Over millions of years of evolution, also our body made important changes which are needed for a good interaction. And since in order for proper interaction, we need robots with similar social, but I think also physical capabilities. And let us look at actuation. Electric motors are very energy efficient and powerful, but only in a very small region, meaning that the payload to mass ratio is still far too low. Humans, it's 10%, while humans can lift their own body weight almost. Energy efficiency also very dramatic. So for that we need bigger batteries. So that means bigger motors. So again, bigger batteries, etc. And so huge progress has been made in developing safe actuation by evolving from position-controlled robots to torque-controlled robots, by introducing active or passive compliance, even developing robots from very soft materials. And so we work a lot with springs to store energy in, for example, our prosthetic feet, which is also now further valorized in a spin-off called Axelis Bionics. We're also developing exoskeletons to assist workers in non-ergonomical postures. And we're also working on self-healing soft materials, so we can damage those materials and then they can repair itself, similar like wounds. And that we do in the European project Giro and SMART, which I'm coordinating. So, but we also look beyond introducing elastic elements, and we introduce, for example, redundant actuators to optimize energy efficiency. Locking mechanisms, so not all the torque goes through the motor, but part parallel through the motor, so the motor is not loaded. Of joint actuation, so we can have a better mass distribution, for example, in rehabilitation exoskeletons. Misalignment compensation, so exoskeletons can be worn much more faster, since the misalignment between axis of rotation of the human joint and the exoskeleton are automatically compensated. And to interact with humans, yes, we also need better sensors. And that's the reason why I recently joined IMEC. For example, in the European project Sophia, we want to improve the ergonomics. So depending on the postures, we adapt the behavior of the robot so the human can always work in an ergonomical way. But for that, we need appropriate sensors to detect what is the postures of the human. For our self-healing robots, we are also now developing self-healing sensors, since touch interaction is largely underrepresented compared to vision and audio. Also, we develop constraint controls so cobots can faster and safer interact with humans, but we miss here the suitable safe sensors to detect where is the human. And here we use motion capture rooms, but of course that's not very practical in real manufacturing settings. And so also for our exoskeletons, we're now integrating sensors in the interfaces for better interaction. And still very preliminary, but the future will not be only one robot and one human, but how multiple robots, each with specific capabilities, in a very flexible world come together and work together there between agents, but also between with humans. And so that's the path we are now starting first now on drones to do the constraint control there, because they're cheap and still they have challenging dynamics, but we want to expand it to different other robots. And finally, robots will have a huge impact on our society, and how we keep the human values as equality, freedom, and solidarity stand ground in such a robotized world. And that's why 56 academics from our university, coming from very different disciplines, joined forces to write a book with 30 thought-provoking questions and a start of an inclusive robot agenda. And we presented this in the Opera de Munt with policymakers, artists, and we went to Paris and New York to present, and then came Corona and we had to stay home, but hopefully soon also in Los Angeles, we hope, Africa and the Middle East. And I want to conclude with a quote I took from Rodney Brooks in a picture I took in IFRR 2018, where he says that how robots and people interact is going to be crucial for a successful world. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. So let's throw it to the front row first. We've got some audience questions, but let's open it up. Here are our front row and our other panelists. Questions? Harold?
Hi, so this question is about physical interactions, human-robot interaction, HRI. So those are very important. We have many settings where physical contact becomes very important. Rehabilitation is one of them. And it's a difficult interdisciplinary problem. So I think Bram was showing some of the great work that he's doing in that space. I'm curious about what is the most challenging barrier or barriers perhaps to fluent physical HRI. Robots are still a little bit clunky in the way they interact with people. Is it touch sensing? Is it actuation? Is it haptics? Or we just don't know the right policies? So learning comes into play. What is the crucial problem that needs to be worked on that perhaps we aren't doing very well right now?
I think in robotics is an integration of the best of technologies, and everything has to be on the correct level, and then we can create breakthroughs. I think see to drones, there all the components, batteries, motors, electronics, AI became at the right level control, and then a lot of applications became possible. I think for a big missing sensor in robotics, I think is skins, robotic skins, and many are working on it, but it's also the biggest organ in our body. And it's also requiring a lot of processing. And there I think, because from vision and audio, we can borrow what Alexa and others are doing, but for touch, there we still need to rely, I think, a bit on ourselves, and we need big breakthroughs. And then also the diversity of the applications we want to handle is, I think, also a huge challenge. In rehabilitation, you have different stroke, spinal cord injuries, and so on. It's a bit like autism, a huge spectrum, and how to go to individualized therapy. But for our papers, we need control groups and large groups and doing everything the same in order to compare. But that's a bit in contradiction with we need to targeting the individual needs of a child. So there is also an issue, I think, there that we need to solve.
Can I add something here? I think, if you have to ask the big challenge here, if you are talking about human-robot interaction, the big challenge is understanding the human you are interacting with. That's I think is the barrier that we have to overcome. Is the big barrier we have to overcome, because you can certainly fake intelligent interactions up to a point. After interacting a little bit with the smart robot, the people really understand that there is not an intelligence behind, and they get bored. So I think the big challenge is to put try to put in the robot a little bit of understanding of what the human is doing, so that it can be, some kind of intelligent interaction can be implemented.
Yeah, and not only the current state of an action, for example, but also the intention. What is the other's thinking? What is his?
Yeah,
and so for a very mutual interaction, we can at the moment mostly interact with what happened and at the moment, but not very well predict what's going to happen, to be much more fluent and synergetic attunement of the different agents in the collaboration.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's a sophisticated teleoperation. Otherwise, if there is no understanding, you can fake it a little bit, but it's a sort of a sophisticated teleoperation. It's not really interaction.
I just wanted to comment on the physical aspects. In the work that we've been doing in so-called field studies, in particular with children, there are many important parts, but it's not just about safety, it's about robustness. If you work with children and you want to allow them in an unconstrained way to interact with the robot, and I'm sure probably Maya has also a lot of experience with that, you know, you will have a robot and the children will pull the robot's arms forcefully. They will move the robot's head. They might squeeze it just to see what happens, because they are children. So for me, there is a big difference between many of the research prototypes that we have and the need, not just research prototype, also commercial products. I would not want to do a study where children play with the Now robot and are allowed to squeeze it and turn it upside down and pull the arms, try to pull them apart. I would not want to do that. Although it is a commercial product, it has just not been built for this context. So for me, in addition to what has been said about the intelligence and to make the robot's behavior more intelligent, more interesting, it is the robustness really, the suitability for real world context, and also to have interfaces for users and practitioners that are being designed in a way that they accept, that they are comfortable with, which then crosses over with the field of human-computer interaction, interface design, usability, user experience, that opens up a whole new area of research that in principle in those projects you need to consider all of it. That makes it so extremely complex.
I couldn't agree more. And in fact, sometimes one has to test and then remove features. And so exactly to Kirsten's point about, you know, we had some, like the video that I showed with the owl-like robot, you might notice that it doesn't have wings. It had wings originally, and then we found that the kids were feeling the wings too much, which is fun for them. But if you're trying to teach them about social relationships, you know, you don't go feeling other people's arms. And so everything is about what is the interaction supposed to be like? What is the context? And then you have to keep iterating, because you just can't anticipate everything that the users will do, any users.
Hey, Juan.
Yeah, I'm not sure if audiences start to wonder, but in all of our presentations, you probably saw that robots are always interacting with one person at a time, whether the robot is learning from a person or whether the robot is, you know, trying to scaffold things to the children. We've seen so many videos that robots are interacting with one person at a time. So I'm curious for your answers on the multi-human to robot interaction aspect, because I know, Bram, you talked about multi-robot to human interaction. So Bram, maybe you could talk about in the manufacturing space, how is the field going towards, because it's now a big theme in our field, right? So how do you deal with multi-human robot interaction? And for Maya and Kirsten, for our social interactions, we are very mindful about, you know, parents in the picture. So maybe a robot assisting and mediating interactions between children and parents with their peers. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so in manufacturing, what you really want is lot size ones. So instead of mass production, mass customization. So that means that every car is different and every shoe is different. So that means that in order to make that, you need to make it close to your market. And that also means that you need robotization to make it affordable. But that means that you need a lot of robots, or you make robots that are very versatile, like humanoids, like humans, but often they're very expensive. So the other possibility is that you go to resource-bounded robots. A robot that can screw, a robot that take something, that can transport something. And for a certain product, and that product can change from product after product, you need other robots that then come together and collaborate, including one of multiple robots. And how you organize that, I think that's still a big question. And that's why we started it with starting to organize a set of drones. We want to expand it to arms. So different agents with different capabilities, and how you make that they interact with each other, that they learn from each other, and that they will learn from humans. But we're only at the very start there. with those videos where we try to make control algorithms so they can be safe on the level, and that we want to improve their performances by now trying to add reinforcement learning on top of it. So we also, I don't believe that everything has to be model-based, because we don't have the models everything. I don't believe in learning everything. I think we need to make the two fields of model-based and AI algorithms come together and make the best of the two worlds, because we saw the disadvantages of reinforcement learning like Dana. You need huge amount of iterations, but on the other hand, it can go in models that we don't know how to form them. And so all those fields have to come together, and there will be challenges, but I think also the big opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I just like to add. I mean, clearly in the last few years, I've seen more and more articles, more and more research studies being published on robots interacting with multiple people and mentioning all the challenges involved. In the work that I've been doing with children with autism in particular, it was always a triadic interaction, a pair of people, the child with autism and a peer or a parent or a sibling, and the robot. I would not call it multi. We never called it multi-human robot interaction, because it was two people and a robot. So we called it triadic interaction. But yes, generally this is a really interesting area, and but it then multiplies again the complexities of what you have with just one or two people. And if you want the robot to interact with 50 people in a sensible way, not just waving hello. I mean, this is trivial, but in some more intelligent way, this is certainly yeah, a really big challenge. Let's see what we can achieve in the future.
I would like to give just a little credit to Elaine Short, who did a dissertation on multi-party interactions in HRI. So she actually did put a robot in a group of people. And the interesting thing was, at that time, the robot wasn't even using what we can do now, which is trying to understand what people were doing. It was just using the perception of their body language and who was and wasn't speaking. So I think there's some baby steps that we're making, but absolutely, it's a wonderful and hard problem. And it is true that we can't wait. We can't just work on one-on-one in hopes of it scaling, because of course it's a different and parallel problem. So I agree, but I want to give credit to the brave folks who are going there.
Tadahiro's had his hand up. Let's go to him next.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the great presentations. So let me ask a general question. So I found that I didn't find any topics related to language. So as you know, in our human society, the many social interaction is on language. So from the viewpoint of human-robot interaction, the language capability is often so limited, and fixed rule, and the fixed vocabulary, the fixed type of conversations. So they don't have no adaptive capability from the viewpoint of linguistic and semantic aspect. So what do you think about the challenges in the human-robot language communication in human-robot interaction?
I mean, this is one of the things that robots are still not very good at. They are good at speaking. You can pre-record voices, you can use text-to-speech, you can have the robot giving a presentation, no problem. You can have the robot detecting a voice, perceiving, you know, the volume, and maybe even identify where the speaker is standing. Understanding is a big problem. In particular, if you don't have a headset like I'm wearing now, if you have a noisy environment, if you have different speakers, people with different accents, people, you know, with different ages, you know, older people, children, speech understanding is still really difficult. And there's some interesting research for more than a decade with the ICAP robot from a developmental robotics perspective, trying to model from a bottom-up perspective how the ICAP could acquire a language, could learn how to speak, and what the meaning of words are, what it hears and what it actually means. But these are still baby steps. Again, it's one of these areas. But yes, as soon as you expose a person to a robot, the first thing in my experience is the person starts to talk to the robot and expects the robot to talk back. But that's the problem.
And just to add to that, I completely agree. Just to add to that, of course, embodied communication is a whole different ballgame from what most of machine learning is focusing on, which is this embodied, like, let's just understand speech. So, in embodied communication, you have social referencing, you have joint attention, you have pointing to objects. There's a whole lot going on. There's gesture, they're back channeling that link to language. So that's a wonderful and rich problem that, of course, we need to do in a situated way. So there's no shortage of language challenges in embodiment.
Can I add a few things? And I know also Tamim asked a related question on Slido. So language is just utmost important in HRI, right? So I'd like to just introduce some of the efforts we are making. So like Maya just said, we're in an HRI domain, it's an embodied conversational agent, right? So it's not just like chatbots where it can generate clever, conversations based on, like recent models, like empathetic dialogue, if you know about Facebook's work. So it's amazing work, but for a robot, a robot is a character, right? So there are times that it has like constraints that needs to be constrained when it's generating new conversations. So some of the efforts that we make in HRI in relation to language is to actually, and as a long-term companion, right? Because we are thinking about long-term interactions. The aspects we as an HRI community are interested in is how can the robot, so it's like a domain of continuous turn-taking, but like how can the robot learn about the user, right? Also then bringing knowledge of its own preferences or its own knowledge, link that with the user's knowledge, and then building, making a continuously expanding knowledge graph, and also then building the language generation based on that. So some of the work I personally do is how to build the agents and the user's knowledge graph and kind of find where things intersect. And of course, it'll grow over time, but then also how can it then generate related dialogue? So we call it a relational dialogue, but how can the robot leverage that? So instead of just crawling online resources, like online data that most of other big NLP communities interested in, how can we also like leverage like the user-centric and agent-centric knowledge to generate language? So yeah, and also like very emotional experience, like shared emotional experience too. Right? So those are the problems that HRI community is trying to solve in terms of language.
Someone asked one of the audience questions. Andrew Stout asks, he would be interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts on the recent failures of and future opportunities for commercial, social, and entertainment robots. Anybody want to take on commercializing?
Yes, in fact, 2 years ago, I was contacting Giulio if I could use some of his quotes on a Facebook message. I think it was with Chris Atkinson and James Kuffner on the failure of some famous social robotics companies. And so as then editor-in-chief of the Robotics and Automation magazine, I wrote an editorial which was picked up by Spectrum, and I can share it in the chat, I think, which exactly discussed this. That's also with the videos that, of course, sometimes sold as results which are only ideas or research ideas in it, or that's maybe not properly mentioning that it's maybe remotely controlled, or what are the boundaries of that technology. And so there's sometimes huge expectations on what robots can do. And one of the other aspects I also think is, we as scientists, we can create amazing things, but what the client really needs and what it can afford to pay it. For example, I went with my daughter, because it's holidays here, to the dinosaurs in a local science museum, and she wanted absolutely to have a dinosaur, so I picked up Pleo. Maybe you still remember that nice robot, but it was so expensive because it had so much motors in it, while Furby was much cheaper, but had only one motor in it. So really targeting your who you want to sell it to and at which price, and how robustity is a huge challenge to make such a company, and the funding for it, it's not software that you can scale so easily.
I guess I could speak to it briefly. You know, I did do a startup in 2016, which launched a product in the socially assisted robotics space in May 2020, and we will see how it fares. And in full disclosure, I haven't personally been involved since the end of 2018. But I would say that, you know, in that context, having experienced the full process, what seems to be missing from the startups to date is the business proposition. Why should someone spend N dollars, where N is quite large still, for the particular product? So far, all the products that have been put on the market fail to have a function that is not done by something else. Like they take pictures, so do phones, but phones are also phones, which is very useful when we all have it. They read recipes. Again, phones do that. You could say they move around, but they don't need to move around to do all of those things. And so it's the missing business proposition, the reason why somebody would actually need them. Here is again where I want to put a plug in for real world problems. You know, we have a giant aging population that needs a lot of things. Where are the products for them? We have a giant population with special needs. Where are the products for them? And these are not niche markets. So again, it's hard to get venture backing for some of those things, but that's where the markets actually are. Why would you spend $800 plus on a robot? What pain is it reducing? If it's just entertaining you, oh, it's got to be a heck of an entertainment thing to do more than your phone. Nothing has met that bar yet. And I think it's the wrong bar.
I think they miss the personal relationship. People, when people buy this social robot, they expect to be able to build a personal relationship with these robots. But then again, this is not possible because this, again, requires the robot to understand some of the feelings, some of the, you know, the intentions of the person, which is not the case. In some cases, they fake the interaction, so they attract people, but, you know, people is smart, and after a while they realize that it's not the real thing. So it basically goes back, like Maya is saying now, it basically goes back to being a little bit more than a smartphone, and then the cost is not justified.
Let's go to another audience question from Brandon Taitran, who asks, how do you think the public's increasing acceptance of robots will affect HRI in the long term? I think goes to something Maya said about, you know, how things are always changing with our users, right?
I know the person who asked the question, so I was going to let someone else answer that question but I mean, I'll take it. But if anyone else would like to speak to it first.
Which question is that? I missed it.
So how do you think, because there's more and more robots that are out there and public is generally accepting robots, how is that going to change HRI in the long term because people are becoming more accepting of robot systems?
There is a Eurobarometer which measured, I think in 2017, the acceptance of it. And we saw that people having experience with robots also have a better acceptance and positive view on robots, because probably they see that they're not killing jobs and going to murder the whole world and see. So I think indeed we see more and more robots coming, and I think we need to be careful how we will design them, and especially like I also mentioned the ethical things. I don't want that something happens like genetic modified organisms, where I think the scientists didn't listen well enough to the public opinion, and like, for example, in Europe, there is a total ban by policymakers on them. So we need to be very careful, and there was also a question on trust, and we need to be very careful there, and that's why we need a close collaboration with the end user to develop them. So the acceptance is much more improved.
I would also.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Go
Maya.
ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to add to that, also going back to the previous question. I mean, if there's an increased acceptance, and it might not be worldwide, so it, you know, we also need to check where and which population. But again, it goes back to also the responsibility of us as the researchers not to raise expectations that these robots cannot fulfill in the near future. So for example, I'm teaching here in Waterloo social robotics and human robot interaction, and I always show my students a few concept videos that have been used for crowdfunding and then I show them videos of actual robots in these particular targeted application areas, real robots and what they can do now. And, even for me, after having seen these videos many times, I sometimes, there is this huge difference. And this is also what Bram and others have been writing about when these companies recently, quite a few companies, social robotics companies, went bankrupt. I think we just need to be careful. It is good if the public becomes more open towards social robots, but we should be careful in not disillusioning them, because then we have another backlash, similar to the AI winters, that oscillated with the AI summers. So we need to be careful how we present robots and how we communicate with the public also about robots.
I wanted to also follow up on this. I think one thing that we really want to think about is how can we demystify robots to the general public so that robots are not perceived as this magical, technology of the future, but it's something that everybody understands. This is how they work. This is what they can do, and this is what they can't do. So I really like the example that Holly showed right at the beginning, where the robot shows its intent. It says, this is what I'm about to do. And then maybe even going beyond and saying, okay, this is why I'm doing it. This, and also, as Kirsten was saying, visualizing not just to the autistic kids, but to the general user, this is what I'm seeing. This is what I think I should do next. Kind of taking off, opening up the hood and showing users, this is what the robot knows. This is what it's capable. So that if the humans users do build trust, the trust is based on the actual reality of the system and not misplaced.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I'd throw out there that I get asked is the issue of privacy, right? And I think this is again about demystifying the reality. What is the robot going to capture that is not already being captured by the various technologies in our lives? But I think this shows how little people understand, what robots are and can be. And so that's just such a very basic issue, yet it's a fundamental one, because if the perception is that they're somehow more invasive, then there is a barrier, and that stems from not knowing better. So it's just a very simple example of the bigger picture.
As an example of that, Maya, we were working with a museum and we had a telepresence robot in the museum, and they wanted us to blur all the faces in the background, so the person that wasn't directly interacting with the robot. And that was a point-to-point communication, right? That was going to a single person controlling the robot, whereas all the parents in the museum had their cell phones out, were videotaping everybody, and it was going up on the web. So they really don't understand what's happening with the robots versus with the cell phones.
Exactly.
Yeah, in some sense, I think it's also, our fault. In sometimes we tend to not because we want to and extend what we are doing, but sometimes we use words to explain what our robots are doing, which are understood in a different way by people. If you say, well, now the robot sees that the person is moving, the person interprets these words as if the robot was understanding what the person was doing. In fact, it was just measuring movements in the world. So I think we should be very careful in explaining what our robots do, using words which convey the right message, not a technological message, but a more human-like message. And then in that sense, because otherwise we create expectations about what our robots are doing that are not fulfilled at the end, and people, get bored, as I was saying initially. So it's also a very, very crucial and important way of communication. I mean, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of a person who doesn't know anything about robots, listening to some of us saying that the robot is understanding, or the robot is perceiving, and the robot is so on and so forth. So that's my feeling, particularly for human-robot interaction. I think most of the failures of social robots are because people were expecting the robots to be able to do more than what the robot was actually designed to do. So it's a mismatch between people presenting what the robot is doing and people understanding what the robot is able to do.
I think that's a fine note to end on. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, the front row, and for the audience for attending our webinar today.
Thanks.